The iron gate screeched open, and Sergei stepped across the line separating him from his past life. 10 years, 3,650 days. He had counted each one, marking them with a pencil on the cell wall, lines that grouped into fives. Now those marks remained there, while he stood free with a worn bag in his hand and 5,000 rubles in his pocket, everything they gave him upon release. Autumn was cold. The wind tugged at his old jacket, which he had worn before his arrest, and it was now too tight across his shoulders. Sergei adjusted the collar and slowly walked along the road leading to the bus stop. Fields stretched around him, patches of yellow grass here and there, gray sky overhead. Freedom smelled of dust and rain. He had thought about this moment every day for the past few years, imagined how he would leave, get on a bus, go to the city, find a job, rent a room, start over. But now that it had happened, he felt no joy, only emptiness and exhaustion. No one was waiting for him. His mother had died 3 years ago. His wife divorced him in his second year of imprisonment, took their daughter and moved to another city. Friends had vanished like smoke. The bus arrived half an hour later. Sergei sat by the window and watched the villages, forests, and kilometer markers fly by. He was returning to where there had once been a home, but there was no home anymore. Chapter 2, City of Strangers. The city greeted him with indifference. People rushed about their business. No one looked at him. Sergei walked familiar streets, but they seemed foreign. Stores had changed their signs. Houses were painted different colors. Even the trees seemed different. He stopped at the building where he once lived with his family. The apartment had been sold long ago for debts. Now other people lived there. Sergei stood for a moment by the entrance, remembering how his daughter used to ride her scooter in the yard, how his wife would meet him from work at the window on the third floor. Then he turned and walked on. First, he needed to find work. Sergei went to the construction office where he had once worked as a foreman. A former colleague met him coldly, apologizing but explaining they couldn't hire him. Everything was strict now. A criminal record was serious business. The rejection stung, but Sergei expected it. Next was an auto repair shop. No positions available. Then a warehouse. He didn't meet the qualifications, they said. A building materials store promised to call back, but never would. A supermarket simply said no without explanation. By evening, Sergei was exhausted. His feet ached from walking around the city. His soul hurt from the rejections. He went into a cheap cafeteria, ordered soup and bread. He couldn't afford more, and ate silently, looking out the window. Rain fell outside, washing the gray streets clean but changing nothing. There was nowhere to spend the night. He found an old abandoned garage on the outskirts and settled there on cardboard boxes. Cold, damp, dark, but at least a roof over his head. As he lay there listening to rain drum on the metal roof, Sergei wondered if this was what freedom looked like. Chapter 3. The fine morning began with rain. Sergei woke from the cold, completely soaked. The garage leaked. He got up, brushed himself off, and went outside. He needed to keep looking for work, but he had almost no strength left. His stomach growled with hunger. The few rubles remaining wouldn't last long. Walking along a deserted street on the outskirts, he heard a faint whimpering. Sergei stopped and listened. The sound came from behind the garbage bins. He approached carefully and saw a dog. Small, dirty, with protruding ribs and fear in its eyes. Its hind leg was injured, blood oozing from the wound. Sergei crouched down. The dog looked at him pitifully, but didn't run away. Too weak. He extended his hand slowly, and it cautiously sniffed his fingers. The animal trembled, unsure whether to trust this stranger. Sergei whispered softly, telling the creature they were both equally unlucky, both unwanted by the world. He took off his jacket, carefully wrapped the dog in it despite the cold morning air, and lifted it into his arms. The animal trembled, but didn't resist, as if sensing he meant no harm. Sergei remembered seeing a sign reading "Animal Shelter" on the neighboring street during yesterday's job search. He headed there, his jacketless body shivering in the wind, but somehow feeling warmer than he had in days. The shelter was located in an old single-story building of a former kindergarten. The area was fenced, and barking could be heard from behind it. Sergei rang the gate bell. A minute later, a woman of about 50 with a tired but kind face opened it. He explained he'd found an injured dog. The woman, introducing herself as Vera Nikolaevna, the shelter director, nodded and invited him inside without hesitation. Chapter 4. First day. Inside the shelter was noisy. Dogs barked in kennels, cats meowed from cages. It smelled of bleach, food, and something sour. Vera Nikolaevna led Sergei into a small room resembling a veterinary office. There was an old table, a cabinet with medications, and a couch. She instructed him to place the dog on the couch, then examine the wound with practiced hands. She washed it, treated it with antiseptic, and applied a bandage. Her movements were confident and precise. Clearly, she'd done this hundreds of times. She mentioned that he was lucky to have found the dog when he did. Another day or two, and it would have been too late. Sergei silently watched her work. When she finished, the dog was already sleeping, calmed by gentle care. Vera Nikolaevna washed her hands and turned to Sergei, thanking him for not passing by. She noted sadly that there were fewer and fewer people who would stop to help. Sergei shrugged, responding quietly that he couldn't just leave the animal. He knew what it felt like to be unwanted, to be nothing to anyone. The words came out before he could stop them, revealing more than he intended. She looked at him carefully and asked about his work situation. Sergei hesitated, then answered honestly that he was looking for work but hadn't had any luck yet. He didn't mention the criminal record, not yet. Vera Nikolaevna thought for a moment, then made an offer that would change everything. She desperately needed help at the shelter. Someone to clean kennels, feed animals, change bedding. The work was dirty and hard, and she could only pay symbolically, food and a place to sleep. But if he wanted, he could stay. Sergei didn't hesitate. He accepted immediately, feeling something shift inside him, the first spark of hope in a very long time. Chapter 5. New Life. The first days were hell. Sergei got up at 6 in the morning and worked until dark. He cleaned kennels, carried heavy bags of food, washed countless bowls, cleaned the territory. His hands hurt, his back ached, muscles he'd forgotten about screamed in protest. But he didn't complain. This was better than wandering the city and sleeping in garages. This was purpose. Vera Nikolaevna gave him a small room in the shelter building. There was a narrow bed, a table, and a closet. The window looked out on the yard with kennels. Modest, sparse, but it was his. It was home. For the first time in 10 years, he had a place that belonged to him, even temporarily. There were about 50 animals in the shelter. Dogs of different breeds and ages, cats, even a few rabbits. Most of them were homeless, picked up from the streets. Some were brought by people who could no longer keep pets. Families moving abroad, elderly owners going to nursing homes, children with sudden allergies. Sergei quickly memorized each animal's character and story. There was an old dog baron with a gray muzzle who always greeted him with a quiet whine, limping on arthritic legs but never missing morning greetings. There was a red cat Lisa who scratched everyone except Sergei, somehow sensing his gentle nature. There was a puppy named Bublik who jumped on him every time he entered the kennel, boundless energy in a small body. Gradually, something began to change inside. Sergei felt needed for the first time in a decade. The animals waited for him, were happy to see him, trusted him unconditionally. They didn't care about his past, his mistakes, his criminal record. They only cared that he showed up, that he fed them, that he spoke gently. The simple acceptance began healing something deep within him that had been broken for years. Vera Nikolaevna also began to trust him. She shared the shelter's problems, the constant lack of money, how difficult it was to find new owners for the animals. Sergei listened and stayed mostly silent. He didn't know how to speak beautifully, couldn't offer clever solutions, but he knew how to work hard. And that, it seemed, was enough. Chapter 6. First Guest. One day, a woman with a 7-year-old daughter came to the shelter. The girl wanted to get a dog. Vera Nikolaevna showed them the animals, telling stories about each one, where they came from, their personalities, their needs. Sergei was working in a distant kennel at the time, repairing a broken fence. Suddenly, he heard a child crying. He turned and saw that the girl had tripped over an uneven stone and fallen, scraping her knee. Her mother fussed nearby, searching through her purse for tissues. Sergei approached, helped the girl stand, and brushed off her knees gently. He told her softly that everything was okay, that small falls happen to everyone. Then he called the puppy Bublik, who immediately ran over with his characteristic enthusiasm and began licking the girl's hands and face. The girl laughed through her tears, the pain forgotten in seconds. Her mother looked at Sergei with genuine gratitude, asking how long he'd been working there and commenting on his natural way with children and animals. Sergei answered briefly that he'd started recently, then excused himself and walked away, feeling something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling. It was the simple satisfaction of helping someone, of making a child smile. Such a small thing, yet it felt enormous. That evening, Vera Nikolaevna approached him while he was washing the day's dishes. She told him he was good with children and animals, that he had a real talent. Sergei tried to deflect, insisting he was just doing his job, nothing special. But she shook her head and explained that animals sense people's true nature. They trusted him, and in her experience, that trust was never misplaced. That meant something important about who he really was inside. Her words stayed with him long after she left, circling in his mind as he lay on his narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if maybe, just maybe, he could be more than his worst mistake. And before we continue, write in the comments what country and city you're listening from. We appreciate you and wish you good spirits. Chapter 7: Storm Clouds. Gathering. 3 months later, the shelter's peaceful routine was shattered. One morning, an expensive black car pulled up to the gates. A man in a sharp suit emerged, carrying a briefcase and an air of authority. He introduced himself as a representative from the district administration and delivered news that made Vera Nikolaevna's face go pale. The shelter had to close. Residential complex construction was planned on this territory. They had exactly 1 month to vacate the premises. The decision had been made at the highest level, he explained with bureaucratic detachment. There would be no appeals, no extensions, no exceptions. When he left, Vera Nikolaevna sat on a bench and cried for the first time since Sergei had known her. This strong woman who faced every challenge with determination finally broke under the weight of impossible circumstances. Sergei approached and awkwardly placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her not to give up, that they would figure something out. But what could they figure out? There was no money to relocate, no other premises available in the area, and 50 animals with nowhere to go, some old, some sick, most completely unadoptable. The shelter was their last chance at life. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Reactions were divided. Some residents openly supported closing the shelter, complaining about constant barking, smells, and decreased property values. They gathered signatures demanding immediate closure, claiming the shelter was a public nuisance. But others opposed the decision. Among them were parents whose children had adopted animals from the shelter, including the family who'd taken Bublik. They began organizing their own petition, collecting signatures against the closure, reaching out to local media, trying to generate public support. Sergei watched the battle lines being drawn and felt increasingly anxious. He'd finally found a place where he belonged, where his past didn't define him. Now that fragile new life was threatened, and he felt powerless to protect it. Chapter 8: Exposure. One evening, while Sergei was locking up the kennels for the night, a neighbor from his old building appeared at the shelter gates. The man approached with a smirk that immediately put Sergei on guard. He asked casually if Sergei really worked at the shelter now, as if confirming a rumor. And when Sergei confirmed it, the man's expression shifted to something calculating. He mentioned that Sergei had served time in prison, asking what the conviction had been for, as if making innocent conversation, but his tone suggested the question wasn't innocent at all. Sergei tensed, telling the man it was his private business. The neighbor backed off with false friendliness, claiming he didn't mean any harm, that people were just curious. But Sergei knew better. He watched the man leave with a sinking feeling in his stomach. The next day, a post appeared in the local social media group. Someone had revealed that the shelter employed an ex-convict, questioning whether people felt safe trusting him with animals and allowing him near children. The comments exploded, some condemning him sight unseen, others trying to defend him, but the damage was done. The scandal grew with each passing hour. Vera Nikolaevna called Sergei into her office. She asked quietly if the allegations were true. Sergei took a deep breath and explained everything. 10 years for involuntary manslaughter. He'd been drunk, lost control of his vehicle, hit a pedestrian who died. He was guilty, had served his full sentence, paid his debt to society. He'd hoped his past wouldn't hurt the shelter, had believed it wouldn't matter here. Vera Nikolaevna sat in silence for a long moment, processing this information. Then she sighed deeply. She told him she knew he was a good person. She'd seen it in how he worked, how the animals responded to him, but she was worried that others might not understand, that the scandal could destroy everything they were trying to save. Sergei immediately offered to leave. He didn't want to create more problems for her or the shelter. This place had given him so much, and he couldn't bear the thought of being the reason it closed. But Vera Nikolaevna shook her head firmly. She told him he would stay. They would face this together as they'd faced everything else. Chapter 9. The Fight Days. Until the shelter's closure melted away like snow in spring. 1 week remained. Volunteers worked frantically to find new owners for the animals, but the scandal around Sergei made everything harder. Many people who'd shown interest suddenly backed out, citing concerns about the shelter's management and judgment. One morning, Sergei arrived to find a group of protesters gathered outside the shelter gates. They carried signs demanding immediate closure, declaring that criminals had no place near children or in their neighborhood. They chanted slogans, their voices angry and righteous, convinced they were protecting their community. Sergei stood at the window watching them, his heart heavy with shame and helplessness. Inside, everything burned: shame for his past, anger at the unfairness, fear of losing the one place he'd found peace. He seriously considered leaving that night, disappearing before causing more damage, but then something unexpected happened. Another group appeared at the gates, parents with children, families who'd adopted animals from the shelter. They positioned themselves between the protesters and the shelter entrance, creating a human barrier of support. The families shared their stories loudly enough for everyone to hear. One woman proclaimed that Sergei had saved her dog's life. Another parent explained how he'd helped her frightened daughter overcome her fear of animals. A father declared that everyone deserves a second chance, that redemption should be possible in a just society. The protesters seemed confused by this counter demonstration. Local journalists who'd come to cover the scandal began interviewing both sides, capturing a more nuanced story than the simple outrage narrative they'd expected. That evening, the local television station aired a feature about the shelter. They showed Sergei working with the animals, his gentleness and dedication evident. They told his full story: the crime, the punishment, the redemption. They interviewed families he'd helped, animals he'd saved, people whose lives he'd touched in small but meaningful ways. The tide began to turn. The next day, people started appearing at the shelter with donations. Some brought bags of food for the animals, others gave money, whatever they could afford. Many came specifically to adopt animals, wanting to support what the shelter represented. The building that had seemed doomed suddenly buzzed with hope and activity. Chapter 10. New Dawn. The deadline came and went, but the shelter remained open. The administration had backed down under intense public pressure and media scrutiny. They couldn't be seen destroying a beloved community institution that had such passionate support. Moreover, touched by the story, they allocated a small grant for building repairs and improvements. Sergei stood in the shelter yard watching workers fix the leaking roof and repair damaged fencing. Baron sat beside him as always, resting his graying muzzle on Sergei's knee in comfortable companionship. Vera Nikolaevna approached and handed him an envelope with a warm smile. Inside was an official employment contract. She explained that he was no longer just a volunteer, but a permanent staff member of the shelter, with a real salary and benefits. His hands trembled as he held the document. Proof that he'd truly rebuilt his life, that he belonged somewhere, that he had value. He thanked her quietly, emotion thick in his voice. She replied that he was the one who deserved thanks. For everything he'd done, for everything he'd become, for showing that redemption wasn't just possible, but real. That evening, Sergei sat in his small room and wrote a letter to his daughter. He didn't know if she would receive it, if she would read it, if she would ever want to see him. But he wrote anyway, hoping that someday the words would reach her. He told her he knew he had no right to ask forgiveness for abandoning her, for the pain his actions had caused. But he wanted her to know he'd changed, that he'd found himself in this unlikely place, surrounded by broken animals who'd helped heal his broken soul. Maybe someday, if she was willing, she might want to meet him. He would wait as long as necessary. He signed it simply, "Your father." Outside his window, dogs barked their evening chorus. Life continued, messy and imperfect, but beautiful in its own way. And for the first time in many years, Sergei felt something he'd thought lost forever. He felt he had a future, a purpose, a chance to become someone his daughter might one day be proud to know. The shelter had saved the animals, but in truth they had saved him. Write if you like this story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. In a couple of days, a new story about the power of forgiveness, hope, and second chances will be released. Don't miss it. Don't miss